Yeah,
Yeah.
so I mean that I'll just recapping then, Ron, for the benefit of your tape. That sort of that takeover by Axel Joseph sent off the ripples into the pond that really precipitated almost going right through to the beer orders and the complete breakdown of the traditional, certainly for the bigger breweries, not in the regions. We'll come on to those a bit later. Well, we won't. That'll be another decade, I think. Well, in my case, there is a, but we can talk about that decade, and we
So, so,
can.
so yeah, no, I'd like to talk about that as well.
Yeah.
So what was there any immediate impact of the takeover of Truman?
Um, well, he sold to Gainsborough. That was hanging in the boardroom. That's the Ben Truman. No, I mean, the first few years we had a sort of little false dawn. I mean, we were still moving down the route of closing Burton, moving all the operations down to London. London was this sort of go-ahead brewery that the original plan, whereas we were producing all sorts of different beers, party guiling all along the way, we had this super system, super efficient. They'd gone off and done their homework, R&D, along with a development team and financial people, and the whole concept, which we never did in the end, was that we were going to brew a strong pale beer, a weak pale beer, and a medium strength brown beer. And we were going to blend all these things in different ratios to give us the complete portfolio of beers, throwing in hop oil and primings and any other crap you want to name to make it the required strength, colour, and an approximate palate. Well, that never quite came to fruition. But in the meantime, what was happening is that the drinking public were changing. We were at this time of continental holidays, people being experienced, and we were far enough away after the Second World War for lager not to be considered a foreign import, and people were drinking lager and not something drunk by proper Englishmen sort of thing. And more lager was being drunk. We did the trial. We were brewing Tuborg initially. Within the Watney Empire, they were acquiring the rights to brew the Carlsberg once we combined together. So we then started brewing Carlsberg and Tuborg, but then Tuborg was more or less dropped. I think they then sold it on to Bass, and we continued to brew Carlsberg. So more and more we were brewing Carlsberg. We were also, funny enough, I mean, one of the things that happened in the 70s and in Brick Lane, we were quite fortunate in many respects in that during this period where CAMRA had formed in the early 70s, as you know, and they had to have their devil incarnate, and their devil incarnate was Watneys Red Barrel. Of course, that was in our stable, if you like, of the group. And we within the pubs, as Red Barrel was being castigated by CAMRA and the like, and really suffering. I mean, it was a real consumer-led revolt against a big brewer's beers. Interestingly, we sort of within the group slightly benefited from that because we were sales of our Ben Truman Export Draft, which was a Red Barrel Worthington-y look-alike, if you like, not a very distinguished keg beer. That really grew quite considerably. Unfortunately, we still hadn't learned the lessons, or we didn't know of the lessons really about DO and overpasteurization. So the beers really were, and I am a big fan of CAMRA and cask beer because at least the beer tastes, if you get it right, fresh. But from day one, the beers leaving the breweries would often be oxidized and overpasteurized, and hence tasted as if they were 3 to 6 months old before they'd even got on the vehicle to go to the pub. So, there were genuine reasons why
Was there
people.
anyone at the brewery worried about this?
Well, we didn't know about it really, Ron. I mean, you had to. I mean, we weren't really that aware. It wasn't until, funny enough, it wasn't even the Danes or the Germans coming across. It was more the Australians who really brought the emphasis on reducing dissolved oxygen. And as far as I know, most of the research that we were doing, certainly within the Grand Met group, was largely connected with about how to reduce costs. Most of the major projects there was some NPD, and we did some new product development in the 70s, but most of it was about how we could reduce costs. And within the brewing, we were moving more and more to things like greater use of unmalted cereal. So we were using percentages of raw barley and then having to use enzymes into the mash, exogenous enzymes into the mash to get the beer, the final wort spec, somewhere close to what you would get from malted barley.
And what form was that in? Was that flaked or just ground up?
No, it's ground. Yeah. We had a special mill for milling barley because it won't go well. It wouldn't crack very easily in a standard malt mill.
So, what percentage of that were you using?
Oh, up to 30%.
Really?
Yeah. It has been used to a much lower extent in a lot of breweries. Some people use raw wheat or wheat flour and things, unmalted cereals. That's not unusual,
No.
maize and things like that. You've seen it. You've seen more recipes than most. But if you look in some of those brewing books, funny enough, the brewing books all largely disappeared. It was either all on rudimentary computers at the time, or more likely on sort of what's that famous company in America that used to make these sheets that go for Kazoo or something like that. Right. Anyway, like a sheet that had a duplicate underneath it.
Okay.
Kazoo or something like that. Sheets like that, where we would just put into the folder. So you might not find the brewing records so much around on those, but you'll see some kind of percentage of, and we weren't alone. I'm not telling tales out of school here. It was we weren't alone.
Well, I was looking at some Barclay Perkins recipes from the 40s, some stout recipes that had 36% base malt in them, 25% sugar.
Yeah.
30-odd% coloured malt, so like a third of the grist coloured malt.
Blimey. That's a hell of a lot, yeah.
Because I was thinking, how the hell does this convert?
I don't know, not very well by the sounds of it.
Because there was almost as much coloured malt as there was pale malt.
Blimey, well, it must have been a light coloured malt then. It can't have been too dark. I mean, you wouldn't drink it if it was too dark, unless it was.
Yeah, no, it was mild malt mostly.
Oh well, mild malt, yeah. I mean, that's still.
But the coloured malt, that was brown, black, amber, and crystal.
Blimey, 30%. Christ Almighty, that would
have over 30%.
Yeah. Oh. Yeah. Well, I mean, and people were doing all sorts of things, and we were adding post-fermentation bittering and extracts and things, all of which really, I mean, it didn't sit that well with myself, actually. Plus, I was then working on shift, which is why I sort of fell out of love with brewing, really, is because brewing lost its romance. For me, I had and I was almost functional brewing at that time. I mean, I did start towards the end of that period, just did start to climb the greasy pole a little bit and take on jobs with more responsibility and sort of through the early part of the 80s and things, and was fortunate enough to be considered for more senior roles, but I spent quite a lot. But that was partly because I was doing my rather daft winter sport. So it was at that point, after finishing that I decided to knuckle down and eventually go through my brewing exams and finished off getting those. So a bit later, but did that in stages.
And did you find that useful for your work at the brewery?
Hugely, yeah. Absolutely hugely. Yeah, both within Grand Met and when I then moved at the end of the 80s to back into traditional brewing when I moved down to Young's Brewery. But yeah, no, the doing the exams, particularly with the increased knowledge that was happening on some of the methods I was talking about, that was huge. And some of the projects that we did in Brick Lane, and there was a period. I know we're not talking about the 80s, we're talking about the 70s, but in the middle of the 80s, there was a sort of reaction by the big boys to go back to tradition. And you can see this quite clearly. And Truman's reinvented itself in the early 80s, because everybody realized that the plastic brown and blue and horrible signage and the red one and the Bash Charrington orange and brown and the corporate plastic was out, and everybody started reinventing their old brands. Worthington came back. Taylor Walker was redone by Allied Breweries in London, and you see them all come back with all those other breweries. But yeah.
I'm trying to remember, what was the name of the first cask beer Truman's brought back? I always keep forgetting it.
There was one called Truman S. There was one called Truman S, which wasn't that good. That was designed by our research people. When we reinvented the brand, we brought out 3 cask beers. There was Truman Bitter, Truman Best Bitter, and Truman Samson Hanbury Strong Ale. And that was in the, when was that? That's probably about the middle 80s, maybe early start of the 80s.
You've forgotten the mild, though.
Oh, we had a mild as well. Yeah, we had the mild. I got the pump clip for the mild somewhere around.
Because I remember drinking that. It was quite nice, the mild. I like that.
Yeah, they were nice beers. Well, I mean, they were based on a number of things, but I was part of the little brewing team who remembered our traditional brewing. The left of the people left in the company at the time, plus the fact that I, being a member of Camera and drinking cask ale, they were sort of based on Young's Ordinary Bitter Special, Fuller's ESB, a bit of the original Truman bitter, a bit of the Ben Truman Pale Ale, and the mild as we used to make it. So we ended up in the 80s. One of my last projects there was to convert what was a keg racker to doing cask beer in keg, and it is an excellent system. It really worked very well, and we were the biggest cask beer packager in the country at that time, I would think, because we were packaging. Well, we may not have been as big as Bass, but we were packaging a hell of a lot for the group down in London. Another story, another decade.
Another decade.
So we're going to go back to the 70s. And of course, my own time in the 70s was probably, I mean, apart from the sort of winter sport that I was doing, was more just running shift and not terribly interesting, really. And that's when I started to realize that I really needed to sort of start getting back into studying, and if I wanted to move around. But what was happening industry wise was the constant combining of breweries, bringing and brewery closures. And I think that was the thing that really, that revolution that Maxwell Joseph had started, the splitting of the brewing from the pubs, the breakdown of the old brewing families. They were all looking over their shoulder for the next person to move in and take them over. So it was, it was a time of, I mean, it became famous as the Whitbread Trail of Destruction. You might remember the T-shirts, Ron, you're of an age that you were around at this time. But I mean, Whitbread were a fabulous company. They were absolutely brilliant because they kept all these lovely breweries. They really did concentrate on training and keeping lovely, lovely breweries. I mean, the Chisel Street, you'll look it up and tell me. I'm sure you know Chisel Street. I mean, that closed in the 70s. Fantastic lover, London brewery. In far better condition, far better upkeep than Truman's have been. But that closed. Luton was built in the 60s, closed not much after that, really.
Well, no,
But
Luton was a huge disaster.
yeah, yeah. And Samsbury and Magor, well, they've all suffered their own problems. I know they're, well, Samsbury in particular.
And Runcorn, that was one of the worst ones.
Yeah.
If you hear
Runcorn.
about the design of Runcorn,
Yeah.
it's completely insane.
I mean, Bass for Runcorn and all these mega breweries. Courage obviously built on the old Simmons, close to the Simmons site at the Reading Brewery down by the N4 there, and close the brewery. So that was all I kept seeing was brewery closures. Bash Charrington, probably the single largest cask ale brewery in the country at Charrington's at Mile End. It dwarfed Brick Lane in some respects. I think they had 10 mash tuns there. I don't know what sizes they were, but I know it was a big room because I did see it. And that closed without a murmur from camera, by the way. I got really upset at one meeting, resigned. But because they had a big campaign for Boddingtons, but not for Charrington's at Mile End, the single largest cask ale brewery in the country. I know it was Charrington's IPA, but actually on its day it wasn't a bad beer. It was only 3.5% alcohol and a bit malty for an IPA, but it was still what it was. It was of its day and age.
Yeah, I think it was a bit stronger than that. I think it was about 1040.
Oh, it might have been wrong. Yeah, you might be right. I think it varied. I mean, I think they all varied around, but I don't remember it being terribly strong.
I've just been looking at lots of analyses from the Mirror of beers from the 1970s.
Yeah,
the Charrington IPA turned up in it from I think 1971.
Yeah,
if I remember right, it was.
71. It might have been. Yeah, I think it probably came down a bit more as they all came down. But sadly, the brewery closed. Mann's at Whitechapel, part of the group. I mean, that was that. On the scale of lovely breweries you might want to work in, you'd probably have Chiswell Street, then maybe Brick Lane, and Mann's would be a little bit under that, unfortunately. But I mean, the Victoria, the original Stag Brewery in Victoria, that had closed previous decade, really. That closed in the 50s or 60s, I think.
Yeah, late 50s. Well, I think they bought the Mann's Brewery to replace it. I think that was the idea.
Well, the Mann's and developed the Mortlake Brewery, of course. Yeah. So most of the production was shifted to Mortlake. But so there was Mann's, there was Charrington's. I mean, obviously, a bit further out at Romford, you had Allied. They were still going for quite some years over at Allied into the 80s. So they were a little bit out of it. Just trying to think of any of the other major London breweries. Courage, as I say, closed Horsley down, and they were still bottling for a while on the old Barclay Perkins site. That was one of the biggest bottling lines in Europe at one time.
All right.
Yeah, it was huge. On the old Barclay Perkins site at Park Street, they used to call it.
Yeah,
it was massive, and they invested in it in the 70s. I mean, it was still going through. I can't remember when Courage closed Horsley down, the Anchor Brewery in Horsley Down.
82, 83?
Early 80s, I think. But they were all on their way out then, really, all kicked off. I mean, we were one of the few survivors, Mortlake and ourselves, in Brick Lane, really, of the bigger breweries. Quite unusual. So apart from that, really, it was you were left to the regionals like Young's and Fuller's in London.
Well, I worry about Fuller's.
Yeah. That's well, fingers crossed. I mean, Asahi are brewers, to be fair to Asahi.
Yeah, but when Americans are saying, "Oh, the Fuller's beers seem to have disappeared from the American market for the most part," that's not a good sign.
It's not a good sign. And why would you buy a traditional British brand if you're not going to try and make something international with it?
I've no idea.
I mean, there is an opportunity, given that almost every beer you go to from a craft brewery in the States is an IPA of a British origin, if you like, in some form or another, be it pastry and absolutely cloudy and minimal bitterness to anything with so many hops you can't taste anything else. I mean, you'd have thought there was room for an original, ESB and Pride in particular with that branding.
I don't know. They don't seem to have much. It looks like they're not interested in pushing the brands in the States anymore.
Not. Sadly not. And I mean, it is, and we are seeing a bit of a repeat of what we saw in the 70s. So during the 70s, it was actually a little bit of a depressing time because all we saw were consolidation, brewery closures. I mean, I'm mainly aware of London. We talked about London, but the same thing was happening throughout the country. The Bass breweries were closing all over the place. Stone and things like that were all closing.
Well, and Bass planned to have only 2 breweries.
Well,
that was their insane plan, was to have just Runcorn and Cape Hill.
Yeah. But I mean, they still had the Burton site, of course, quite big. But that.
Yeah, I think they were planning on closing that.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I mean, Salisbury was meant to do the lot. I mean, they all love these mega breweries. I mean, you put them in the middle of nowhere, you forget that everything has to travel to it. I mean, there we are. We're sitting in the centre of your major market when you sit in Brick Lane, and the property was gifted to you effectively. It came from your forebearers. For a short-term gain, you then got to go bring your beer from the arse end of nowhere or from the bottom end of Wales, bring it all the way into London. I mean, it's just nonsense, isn't it? And then you've got to take all the empties back out there again to get them filled up, to bring them back to your biggest market. I mean, where is the sense in that?
Well, none at all. Huh?
I know, but you can see it in hindsight. But it's still happening. It's still happening.
So when Brick Lane closed, where were the Truman pubs getting supplied from Mortlake?
Yeah, well, that was we had a series of depots. We'd split really when towards the end. I mean, particularly after the beer orders, but it started happening before that. We'd split the pubs from the things. We also split distribution. So what we call the radial distribution, the stuff that took the beer from the pubs. So Brick Lane finished up. Funny enough, I mean, almost against the odds, and a chap called Mike Spillane, who was one of my bosses, he was production director at Brick Lane, did an absolute blinder. We put in new keg lines, we converted the keg to do all the cask beer in the group. He realised that our major market was still in London. So we didn't distribute radially from there. We've got a series of half a dozen depots dotted around London. But we used to ship it out in 40-foot vehicles to take it out. But of course, if you've ever been to Brick Lane, you can imagine a succession of 40-foot vehicles trying to get up and down Brick Lane just outside the city. It was an absolute nightmare. It was always going to fail. It was a lovely idea, and he got away with it, and he was right. But it wasn't going to last, sadly, because it got more and more challenging. I mean, Brick Lane is a tiny little road. We come off commercial road, but it was still a bit of a nightmare.
Yeah.
We got it to work.
And so, I mean, did you get worried when you were seeing all this happening in the industry about?
Yeah, well, I mean, that's another reason really for not pursuing too much with the exams, because where was brewing going? It was I was just a production supervisor. I didn't really use any of the brewing knowledge or skills that I had. The brewery had lost its romance. They're a bit soulless, modern brew houses can be. I mean, some of them are very good, and I've no problem. They can have some real good challenges. So, as I mentioned, I sort of went up a bit, and I got involved in some of the design and the planning, and there you can really start to get back into thinking about the operation, and also thinking about how the operators operate, and involving them and giving them some satisfaction. But throughout the 70s, it was a bit of a drudge. We were on, instead of our lovely shift pattern where we stayed in the flat overnight and we had beer on tap, it was the brewery sites all became dry. and you would go in, 6 till 2, 2 till 10, 10 till 6, and weekends, and oh dear, and you're there, and you're endless repetition of the same thing, brew after brew after brew, and you weren't doing anything. You were just really trying to keep on top of the operators. Well, not so much the operators, they were pretty good, but the engineering side of things, blockages, things not happening, deliveries not happening, or things in the wrong place, or whatever. All you were doing is constant firefighting. You weren't brewing, as I call it. You would sit in the control room and you would press the buttons and have a cup of tea, and you'd press the buttons and have another cup of tea. Sometimes you had to go and fill the hoppers with hops, or things get stuck, which they used to before we put the whirlpools in and moved over to pellets when we were still brewing with whole leaf hops. Constantly the kit would jam up trying to get rid of the hops automatically. It's a lovely idea, the pond off machines, but invariably they would block because hops are very sticky, particularly when they've got lots of trub in them, and the conveyors wouldn't work, and you'd have to end up putting on the ovals and breaking the thing down and digging it out and shoving. Oh dear, and it was just firefighting and not utilizing brewing. It had no romance from it. I think that for me was the key thing about the 70s. Brewing lost its romance on a personal front, and I think that was true in the industry. We were using more and more, as I mentioned earlier, more and more adjuncts. We were looking for cheapening. All breweries had to minimize losses, and there were practices there which didn't help beer quality as well. That change didn't happen until quite later into the 80s, when we changed the duty place, because up until then we paid duty at collection. So when the works were collected prior to fermentation, and all the losses incurred in fermentation and packaging, etc., moving, they were all on duty paid beer. So we were recovering tank bottoms, we were recovering pressings from yeast, we were recovering anywhere you could possibly recover beer from. We were recovering and putting it back in, which really doesn't help you get the best quality. You spend time settling in a tank, and then you take the bottoms out and concentrate them and put them back in. Almost, you take out some of the solids, but all the molecules which go through what you can't take out just go back in the beer, and they're all the things that cause you problems downstream. So you end up concentrating on the wrong things instead of the joy of brewing and the pleasure of brewing. And so on a personal front, it wasn't a great decade. Apart from that, I had a good time because I sort of adjusted my life to do the shift. I was able to do lots of shifts during the summer, so I could build up credits to take time off in the winter. And I sort of had a good time, really. So personal front, but not from the brewing. The brewing was a means to an end rather than the end I wanted to achieve, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, no, I understood that. Getting back to all the stuff that was going in the beer, were Truman's using ullage as well?
They were, but not probably soon after I started, funny enough. They were recovering some trade ullages if they could guarantee it. And we used to inspect the trade ullage before it went into the ullage return system. And that was one of the jobs we used to do. And they were recovering trade ullage, yeah. Not a great practice.
No.
But again, it was all processed so that it was, but the DOs must have been through the roof. And we used to have to taste it. And you would say, right, no more than 3% blend in or something like that. But it blended into the milds and things. But then you're just generating more problems. But we used to pasteurize it. I don't know if you're familiar with the technical terms. We use something called a pasteurization unit, which is you hold a unit of beer at 60 degrees for 1 minute, and it's 1 PU. Well, we were putting many thousands of PUs cooking the beer effectively. That was going back in. So, I must say that some of those practices, and of course, we were in a position really to say no to all of that. economically, you couldn't afford to say no. It was one of our KPIs, if not one of the most important KPIs, the losses and the beer recovery systems. Yeah, I mean, it wasn't great, I must say. And it's only now you can speak about it openly because it is in the past, but I know. And yeah, that's what we had to do.
Yeah, well, I keep reading about it at breweries, and I think it was probably pretty universal.
Oh yeah, yeah.
Maybe there were some weirdos who weren't doing it, but I think most breweries were.
Oh, even the regionals, yeah. Oh yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Yeah, no, and some still are to some extent.
Yeah, there's no real point anymore.
Well, I don't know. I don't know who, Rob.
You don't know who. Okay, well, I think we're just about done, actually.
Yeah. So anyway, the 80s were a slightly better period.
Okay.
On the personal front, and there were some changes in the industry which started to change things around a bit. Plus, the growth of the craft market effectively started. That sort of started in the States, really, around about the 80s. So and there were green shoots appeared out of the carnage, which was effectively the change from the rump of the great British brewing industry. Really, the 70s saw their wholesale almost destruction. It started the change. It wasn't all then, Bass didn't give up until a bit later, but they got rid of the breweries, that cutting of the tide, a cutting of the whole economics, and the breweries just left out there stranded, because it's very difficult to make money in today's brewing world. And it was even more difficult in those, purely as a brewery.
Yeah.
You were a whole vertically integrated concern.
Unless you were Guinness.
Unless you were Guinness.
And they kicked off the whole beer orders thing. Did you know that?
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
That it was a complaint from them that prompted everything.
Oh, no. Well, but why they kicked that off? Because it was in every pub anyway. I mean, what happened?
Because there were some of the other big breweries were playing around with like Murphy's or other.
Was it, and that was it with Murphy's and Beamish, and a couple of other stouts, weren't there, around at the time? And they wanted to break the stranglehold that Guinness had in their pubs, because almost every pub had to have Guinness.
No, every pub did.
So and then they faced a bit of competition in themselves, and all of a sudden they didn't like it. So we're going to kick the whole bloody citadel down.
Yeah, it's a whole interesting thing.